My husband threw divorce papers at my face on our 7th anniversary and laughed, telling me to enjoy living in a cardboard box while he drove off with his mistress. He thought my career was just a pathetic doodling hobby, completely unaware that the company I secretly built had just been acquired for $15 million. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit subscribe if you have ever had to remind an arrogant man exactly who he is dealing with. My name is Jillian, and I am 33 years old. I spent the last 7 years married to a man who measured human worth strictly by the balance in a bank account. I just never realized how completely bankrupt his soul was until the night of our anniversary. I was sitting alone in a booth at the Oak Room, which is widely known as one of the most expensive and exclusive steakhouses in Boston. The mahogany-paneled walls and dim crystal lighting usually felt romantic, but tonight they just felt oppressive. I had been waiting for exactly 45 minutes. My water glass had been refilled 3 times by a waiter whose polite smile was rapidly turning into a look of profound pity. In my lap, my hands rested over a custom leather box containing a vintage watch I had spent months tracking down for my husband Ethan. He was a corporate sales director, and he cared about status symbols more than anything else in the world. When Ethan finally walked into the dining room, he did not look like a man rushing to apologize to his wife for being late. He strolled in with his shoulders thrown back, a smug smile playing on his lips and his suit jacket unbuttoned. He did not smell like the office. He smelled like expensive gin and a heavy floral perfume that I absolutely did not own. He did not even bother sitting down. Instead, he stood over the table, reached inside his tailored jacket, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed it, landing it squarely on top of my pristine, empty dinner plate. "Sign them, Jillian," he said, his voice carrying a casual cruelty that made my blood run cold. "I am not wasting another evening pretending to care about this dead-weight marriage." I looked down at the envelope. The words "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage" were printed clearly across the top page that spilled out. I looked back up at the man I had promised to spend my life with, trying to process the sheer audacity of what was happening. We had a reservation. We were supposed to be celebrating 7 years together. Ethan let out a sharp, mocking laugh that caused the couple at the next table to turn and stare. "Do not look at me with those big, confused eyes," he sneered, resting his knuckles on the table and leaning in close. "Vanessa is waiting for me in the limo out front. We have a private flight to Aspen in 3 hours, and I want to start my vacation without any baggage. So let us make this quick and painless." Vanessa. She was his 25-year-old junior sales associate. For the past year, whenever I asked why he was coming home at 2 in the morning, he would roll his eyes and tell me that if I understood how real business worked, I would not ask such stupid questions. He told me he was mentoring her. Apparently, the mentoring involved trips to Aspen. I sat perfectly still, my hands gripping the leather watch box under the table. A normal person would have cried. A normal person would have screamed or thrown the glass of ice water directly into his smug face. But growing up dealing with people who constantly tried to make me feel small had taught me a valuable lesson. Never give your enemy the satisfaction of seeing you bleed. "You are doing this right now?" I asked, my voice remarkably steady, despite the hurricane of betrayal tearing through my chest. "In the middle of a restaurant on our anniversary." "Anniversaries are for equals, Gillian," Ethan said, his voice rising slightly, clearly enjoying the audience he was drawing from the surrounding tables. "You and I have never been equals. I have carried you for 7 long years. I paid the mortgage on that beautiful house in Beacon Hill, while you sat in the spare bedroom playing with your colored pencils. I am a graphic designer," I corrected quietly. "You are a freelancer who occasionally makes a flyer for a bakery." He shot back a vicious sneer, crossing his face. "It is a pathetic little doodling hobby that never brought a real dime into our household. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to introduce you to my corporate partners? I tell them my wife colors for a living. You have never contributed a thing to my life except holding me back." He crossed his arms, puffing out his chest as if delivering a victorious sales pitch. "And do not even try to bring up that measly 5 grand your father left you when he died. What did you do with that inheritance, Gillian? You blew it on some failed startup dream, while I paid for the groceries and kept the lights on. Well, the free ride is officially over. Vanessa actually understands what it takes to be a power couple. She knows how to treat a successful man. He tapped his finger hard against the divorce papers. I want you out of my house by midnight. Do not try to pack anything valuable. You did not pay for the furniture. You did not pay for the electronics. And you certainly did not pay for that roof over your head. Take your cheap clothes and get out. The silence that followed his outburst was deafening. The entire section of the restaurant had gone dead quiet. The waiter was standing a few feet away, frozen in horror with a water pitcher in his hand. Ethan stood tall, waiting for the tears, waiting for the begging, waiting for me to fall apart and prove exactly how weak and dependent he believed I was. I looked at the divorce papers, then looked up at Ethan. The sheer arrogance radiating from his pores was almost blinding. He truly believed he held all the power. He believed he was discarding a worthless dependent wife to upgrade his glamorous lifestyle. I reached into my purse and pulled out a pen. Ethan smirked, nudging the divorce papers closer to me. That is a good girl, he mocked. Just sign the bottom line and you can go find a nice cheap apartment somewhere in the suburbs. I bypassed the manila envelope entirely. I reached over, pulled the leather billfold containing the restaurant receipt toward me, and signed my name on the credit card slip, leaving a generous tip for the waiter who had to witness this spectacle. Then I stood up, slung my purse over my shoulder, and pushed my chair in. I left the divorce papers sitting exactly where he had thrown them, right in the middle of a smudge of steak sauce. "What are you doing?" Ethan demanded, his triumphant smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "I told you to sign the papers. My lawyer will review them during normal business hours," I said, keeping my tone as professional and detached as if I were speaking to a difficult client. "Have a nice trip to Aspen, Ethan. Try not to freeze." I turned my back on him and began walking toward the exit. I could feel the eyes of every patron following me, but I kept my head held high, my posture completely straight. "You have until midnight," Jillian Ethan shouted after me, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls, his temper flaring because I was denying him the dramatic victory he had orchestrated. "If you are not out of my house by the time my flight takes off, I am calling the police and having you removed for trespassing." I did not break my stride. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the freezing Boston night. The cold air hit my face, and for the first time a slight tremble ran through my hands. It was not from heartbreak. It was from pure unadulterated adrenaline. The rain had started to fall, a steady freezing drizzle that coated the pavement in a slick sheen. I hailed a passing taxi and slid into the back seat, giving the driver the address to the beautiful Beacon Hill home I had lovingly decorated and cared for over the past 7 years. During the 20-minute ride, my mind was racing. I needed to pack my essential documents, my clothes, and my old work laptop, the one Ethan constantly made fun of because it was missing a key. I needed to get out before midnight and find a hotel. I refused to be in that house a second longer than necessary. The taxi turned onto our quiet tree-lined street. I paid the driver and stepped out onto the cobblestone sidewalk, wrapping my coat tighter against the biting wind. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. As I approached the front pathway, I stopped dead in my tracks. The porch light was off, but the street lamp illuminated the front yard perfectly. Sitting right in the middle of the perfectly trimmed grass, soaking wet in the freezing rain, were 3 large suitcases. They were my suitcases. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked up the driveway. I recognized the floral pattern of my favorite blouse sticking out from the zipper of the largest bag, which had been hastily crammed shut. My winter boots were tossed carelessly on the wet concrete path. I walked past the ruined luggage and climbed the porch steps. I reached into my purse, pulled out my house key, and slid it into the brass lock. I turned it to the right. It did not move. I tried again, applying more pressure. The key refused to turn. Ethan had not just ambushed me at the restaurant to demand a divorce. He had planned this down to the very last detail. While I was sitting in that restaurant for 45 minutes, waiting for my husband to show up for our anniversary, he had already packed my belongings, thrown them out into the mud, and had a locksmith change the locks on the front door. A sharp metallic click sounded from the other side of the heavy oak door. The deadbolt slid back and the door slowly creaked open, revealing the brightly lit hallway inside. But it was not Ethan standing in the foyer of my home. Standing in the brightly lit doorway of my own home was a woman I recognized immediately. She was 10 years younger than me, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smug expression that made my stomach turn. But what made the breath catch in my throat was not the fact that my husband's mistress was standing in my house. It was what she was wearing. Vanessa was wrapped in a pale pink silk bathrobe. It was not just any robe. It was the very last birthday gift my father had bought for me before he passed away. I only wore it on special occasions, keeping it carefully hung in the back of my closet to preserve the delicate fabric. Seeing it draped over the shoulders of the woman who was destroying my marriage felt like a physical violation. Vanessa leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms and looking down at me as I stood in the freezing rain. She smiled a sharp, predatory smile and told me that Ethan was finally upgrading his life. She said he was tired of coming home to a woman who smelled like cheap coffee and anxiety. She told me I should have known this was coming. I stood there on the wet cobblestones, letting the cold rain soak through my coat. I did not scream. I did not demand that she take off my father's gift. I simply asked her why my belongings were sitting in the mud. Vanessa laughed, a high-pitched sound that echoed in the quiet neighborhood. She walked out onto the covered porch, completely shielded from the rain, and looked at my ruined suitcases. She said Ethan did not want any trace of my pathetic existence left in the house when they got back from Aspen. She stepped closer to the edge of the porch, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me. She told me I was stupid for never noticing what was going on right under my nose. She bragged that Ethan had been funding her lavish lifestyle for over a year. I listened in silence as the missing pieces of my financial life suddenly locked into place. I remembered last summer when Ethan told me he had lost his annual bonus in a volatile stock trade, making me feel guilty for asking if we could finally fix the leaking roof. Vanessa proudly informed me that the bonus had actually paid for her luxury condo downtown. I remembered the nights I skipped buying groceries to cover what Ethan claimed were unexpected business expenses. Vanessa sneered and said those business expenses were weekend getaways to Miami and diamond tennis bracelets. Every time I had noticed a discrepancy in our accounts, Ethan had gaslighted me. He would raise his voice, punch the walls, and tell me I was terrible at math. He made me feel crazy for questioning him while he was busy handing our marital funds over to a 25-year-old girl. Vanessa looked down at my bags and noticed my heavy black laptop bag sticking out from under a pile of wet sweaters. It was an old machine, battered and scratched, missing the escape key from years of relentless typing. She scoffed, calling it a piece of garbage just like my career. Then before I could react, she lifted her foot and kicked the laptop bag right off the top step. The heavy bag tumbled down the concrete stairs, hitting the wet pavement with a sickening crunch. I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering as the screen cracked inside its casing. Vanessa smiled, looking incredibly pleased with herself. She told me to take my broken toys and get off her property before she called the police. Then she turned around, walked back inside my home, and slammed the heavy oak door, shutting me out into the cold, dark night. I walked over to the bottom of the stairs and knelt in the freezing puddle. I reached out and gently picked up my battered laptop bag. Vanessa thought she had just broken a worthless piece of junk belonging to a failed freelancer. She had absolutely no idea that the hard drive inside this machine contained the foundational source code for my educational technology platform. This broken piece of plastic was the genesis of an entire empire. It held the early late-night prototypes, the client databases, and the proprietary algorithms that had just changed the landscape of neurodivergent education. I held the laptop against my chest, shielding it from the rain as best as I could. I pulled my phone from my pocket and ordered a cab. I stood in the freezing downpour for 20 minutes, refusing to look back at the dark windows of my house. I would not give Vanessa the satisfaction of seeing me break. When the cab finally arrived, the driver helped me load my soaking wet suitcases into the trunk. He was an older man with kind eyes, and he immediately turned the heat up in the back seat when he saw me shivering. He asked if I was all right, and I told him I was just surviving. He nodded silently, understanding that some nights require quiet endurance rather than conversation. I asked him to take me to a modest budget motel on the outskirts of the city. I knew I needed a safe place to regroup, to dry off, and to figure out my next move. The 20-minute ride felt like an eternity. My clothes clung to my skin, and the reality of my situation began to settle heavily on my shoulders. I was 33 years old, My marriage was over, my home was gone, and my husband was currently flying to a ski resort with a woman wearing my dead father's gift. We pulled into the parking lot of the motel. The flickering neon sign cast a harsh red glow over the wet asphalt. I asked the driver to wait for a moment while I went inside to secure a room, ensuring I had a place to stay before unloading my ruined bags. The motel lobby smelled of stale cigarette smoke and strong cleaning supplies. The night clerk looked exhausted, barely glancing up from his computer screen as I approached the counter. I asked for a single room for the night. He quoted me a price of $89 and held out his hand for a credit card. I reached into my wet purse and pulled out my debit card, linked to the joint checking account I shared with Ethan. I handed it to the clerk, grateful that the nightmare of this evening was almost paused. I just needed a hot shower and a bed. The clerk swiped the card. The machine beeped a harsh, angry tone. He frowned and tried inserting the chip. The machine beeped again. He looked up at me with a tired expression and said the card was declining. He asked if I had another form of payment. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I told him to run it one more time, assuring him there had to be a mistake. We had over $40,000 in our joint savings and checking accounts. I had personally deposited my last two freelance payments just 3 days ago. The clerk shook his head, pointing to the screen, indicating that the bank was completely rejecting the transaction due to insufficient funds. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind. I stepped back from the counter, pulling out my phone and opening my banking application. My fingers were trembling so badly, I had to type my password 3 times before the screen finally loaded. I stared at the digital dashboard. The numbers on the screen made no sense. Our joint checking account balance reads $0. I quickly tapped over to the savings account, the emergency fund I had built over the last 5 years by sacrificing my own needs. Skipping haircuts, wearing old shoes, and denying myself any luxuries was completely wiped out. The transaction history showed a massive wire transfer initiated by Ethan exactly 2 hours ago, moving every single cent into an unknown offshore account. He had taken everything. He had not just thrown me out of my home. He had deliberately orchestrated a total financial blockade, ensuring I would be left completely destitute on the street in the middle of a winter storm. I scrolled down to my personal checking account, the one I used for small daily expenses. The balance flashed on the screen in bright bold numbers, $14.00. I stood in the dingy motel lobby, dripping wet onto the cheap carpet, holding a declined debit card. I could see the cab driver waiting outside in the rain, the meter ticking higher and higher with money I did not have. The clerk was staring at me, waiting for me to leave or produce cash. The sheer weight of the betrayal was suffocating. Ethan had executed a masterclass in financial abuse. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, ragged breath, trying to stop the tears from finally falling. I was cornered. I was trapped. And then my phone chimed in my hand. It was not a text message from Ethan gloating about his victory. It was a secure, encrypted notification tone specifically set for my financial attorney, Harrison. I opened my eyes and looked down at the screen. A new email had just bypassed my security filters, landing directly in my primary inbox. The subject line read, "Acquisition finalized." My thumb hovered over the screen as I opened the message. The text was brief, professional, and carried the weight of 1,000 suns. Harrison wrote, "Jillian, I am pleased to inform you that the final signatures have been verified. The corporate acquisition deal is completely finalized. The payout of $15 million has successfully cleared the holding period and has been deposited directly into your isolated premarital LLC trust. Congratulations on an extraordinary achievement." I read the words again and then a third time. The numbers burned themselves into my retinas. $15 million. Ethan thought he had left me with $14. He thought he had severed my lifeline and tossed me into the gutter. He had absolutely no idea that by filing for divorce tonight, he had legally separated our assets just hours before my massive corporate payout cleared into an account he did not even know existed. I was not a destitute woman begging for a motel room. I was a multimillionaire standing in a wet coat. I looked up at the motel clerk, slid my phone into my pocket, and felt a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. The game had just changed, and Ethan was about to learn exactly what happens when you underestimate the woman you thought you broke. I spent the entire night sitting in a cracked vinyl booth at an all-night diner right next to that budget motel. The cab driver had kindly let me out there when I realized my debit card was useless. I used 3 of the 14. Ethan had left me to buy a bottomless cup of black coffee. I did not sleep a single wink. Instead, I spent 8 straight hours messaging my attorney Harrison on my phone, outlining the exact blueprint of my husband's financial execution. By the time the sun began to rise over the dreary highway, casting a gray light through the rain-streaked windows, I felt more alive than I had in years. I was just gathering my ruined belongings to leave when the diner bell chimed. The absolute last person I expected to see walked through the glass doors. Patricia, my mother-in-law, looked entirely out of place standing on the sticky linoleum floor. She was wearing a pristine cream-colored cashmere coat and carrying a designer handbag that cost more than most people made in a year. She scanned the room with a look of profound disgust, her nose literally wrinkling at the smell of fried bacon and cheap bleach. When her eyes locked onto me sitting in the corner booth, her expression hardened into a mask of pure contempt. She marched over and slid into the seat across from me, refusing to unbutton her coat. She did not ask how I was. She did not ask why I was sitting in a roadside diner in damp clothes with mud on my boots. She simply reached into her immaculate handbag and pulled out a crisp, folded document and a personal check. She slid them across the scratched laminate table, tapping her manicured fingernail against the paper. $5,000. That was the amount written on the check in her sharp, elegant handwriting. Take the money and sign the paper, Jillian. She commanded, her voice carrying that aristocratic edge she used to intimidate service workers. It is a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a total waiver of any right to seek alimony or marital support. You will sign it right now and you will quietly walk away from my son. I stared at the check and then at her. I asked her if Ethan knew she was here trying to buy me off. Patricia scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. Ethan is far too busy building his future to deal with your messy exit. I am handling this because I always knew it would come to this. I always knew your middle-class roots would drag him down. You simply lack the pedigree and the ambition required to stand beside a rising corporate star. You have no drive, Jillian. You sit at home playing with your little graphic design projects while Ethan works himself to the bone. He needs someone who understands wealth and social standing, someone like Vanessa. Hearing her praise the 25-year-old girl who was currently wearing my dead father's silk bathrobe made a hot spark of anger flare in my chest, but I kept my face completely blank. Thank you for the generous documentation, Patricia. I said, my voice perfectly level. Patricia looked incredibly smug, mistaking my calm demeanor for absolute defeat. She truly believed she had just bullied a helpless, penniless woman into submission. She pulled out her phone right in front of me and quickly typed a message. I could easily read the reflection of her screen in the diner window. She texted Ethan saying she just bought out the trash. She stood up, smoothed her cashmere coat, and walked out without another word, leaving me alone in the booth. An hour later, a sleek black town car pulled up outside the diner. Harrison had sent it for me. I climbed into the warm leather interior and headed straight for the financial district. Harrison was a ruthless, brilliant financial attorney who had helped me set up the impenetrable legal structure for my company years ago. He was one of the few people on earth who knew my actual net worth. When I walked into his massive corner office overlooking the Boston Harbor, he immediately handed me a hot cup of artisanal coffee and pointed to a dry change of clothes his assistant had purchased for me. After I changed into a sharp-tailored suit, I felt like myself again. I sat across from Harrison's massive glass desk and handed him Patricia's check and the non-disclosure agreement. Harrison examined the documents and let out a sharp, genuine laugh. He shook his head in disbelief. He told me this was textbook financial coercion. He explained that a mother-in-law attempting to bribe a spouse to waive alimony under threat of professional blacklisting would be spectacular evidence when we finally went to court. He placed the check and the contract into an evidence folder, locking it securely in his desk drawer. Now, Harrison said, cracking his knuckles and turning to his multiple computer monitors, let us see exactly what Ethan has been up to. While we talked, Harrison was running a deep forensic audit on Ethan's financials. We needed to know exactly how much marital money Ethan had funneled to Vanessa to fund her luxury condo and expensive jewelry. I wanted every single dollar accounted for in our countersuit. The office went quiet, except for the rapid clicking of Harrison's keyboard and the soft hum of the city traffic far below. I sipped my coffee, feeling a deep sense of security, knowing I had the best legal mind in the city working on my behalf. Suddenly, the typing stopped. I watched as Harrison leaned closer to his center monitor. The confident, amused expression he had worn since I arrived completely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of absolute stunned horror. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes as if he could not believe what he was seeing on the screen. He clicked his mouse a few more times, pulling up several scanned banking documents. Harrison, I asked, setting my coffee cup down on the desk. What is it? What did you find? He looked at me, his face pale and his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from a strategic divorce planning session to something much darker and far more dangerous. Jillian, he said slowly, choosing his words with terrifying precision. Ethan did not just drain your joint accounts last night. 3 months ago, he took out a $200,000 home equity line of credit against your house, and he forged your signature to do it. The silence in Harrison's office was absolute and heavy. I stared at the financial documents displayed on his bright monitor, feeling a strange sense of awe at my husband's sheer stupidity. Forging my signature on a federal bank loan was not just an aggressive divorce tactic to get fast cash. It was a serious felony. Harrison leaned back in his leather executive chair and steepled his fingers, looking at me with a sharp, predatory gaze. He told me that we could go to the police right this second and have Ethan arrested before lunchtime. I looked out the massive glass windows at the sprawling Boston skyline and shook my head slowly. I told Harrison that putting Ethan in jail today would be far too easy. It would immediately halt the divorce proceedings and unnecessarily complicate my corporate acquisition payout. I wanted Ethan to feel completely safe. I wanted him to walk into the courtroom believing he held all the winning cards right up until the exact moment we let him destroy himself. Harrison smiled a wide, genuine grin and locked the forged loan documents inside his secure wall safe. He told me to go about my day as if absolutely nothing had happened. The next morning, I met my business partner Penelope at an upscale cafe located deep in the financial district. Penelope was brilliant, fiercely loyal, and the lead software architect for our educational platform. We were sitting at a quiet corner table, tucked behind a large potted fern, reviewing the final transition documents for the corporate buyout. We were discussing how to integrate our proprietary code into the acquiring company's massive server network. I was wearing a simple gray cashmere sweater and dark slacks, looking completely ordinary and unassuming. The brass bell above the cafe door chimed loudly, cutting through the low hum of morning conversation. I did not need to look up from my paperwork to know exactly who had just walked in. The heavy, cloying scent of expensive floral perfume and the loud, performative laughter signaled Vanessa's arrival. She walked into the busy cafe, flanked by 3 of her friends, acting like she owned the entire city block. She was wearing a beige designer trench coat that I knew for a fact had been purchased with the stolen money from my house equity. Vanessa spotted me sitting in the corner almost immediately. Her eyes lit up with malicious delight as she nudged her closest friend and pointed in my direction. She whispered something to her group, causing them all to stare and giggle behind their hands. Instead of walking to the back of the long line, Vanessa marched directly up to the barista counter, which was situated just a few feet from my table. She pulled a crisp $20 bill from her oversized designer purse and slapped it loudly on the marble countertop. She looked directly at me and told the barista in a voice loud enough for the entire crowded cafe to hear that she wanted to pay for the poor, soon-to-be ex-wife's coffee. She said it was the absolute least she could do, since I was probably struggling to afford basic necessities now that Ethan had finally cut off my weekly allowance. Penelope stiffened beside me, her hands balling into tight fists under the table. She knew exactly how much money had just cleared into my isolated trust account. Witnessing this 25-year-old junior sales associate trying to publicly humiliate a multimillionaire CEO was almost too much for Penelope to bear. I placed a calming hand on Penelope's arm, silently urging her to stay seated. I slowly stood up from the table, picking up my empty ceramic coffee cup. I walked over to the counter and looked down at the $20 bill, then looked directly into Vanessa's heavily mascaraed eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level and icy cold, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. I told Vanessa that she was being very generous, but she really should not make a habit of spending credit she did not actually own. I told her that relying on a man who financed his entire lifestyle through high-interest debt was a very dangerous game to play. She had absolutely no idea that the documents on that table were simply blank decoy pages we used for taking temporary notes. The actual $15 million acquisition contracts were safely locked in a digital encrypted vault on my secure cloud server. I simply pulled a dry napkin from the metal dispenser and calmly wiped a single drop of coffee off my leather bag. I did not raise my voice. I did not react to her childish provocation. I just looked at her with the kind of detached pity a senior executive reserves for a poorly performing intern. My total lack of reaction seemed to rattle her even more. She turned her back to me and loudly ordered 4 complicated, expensive drinks for her friends, clearly trying to reassert her dominance over the situation. She pulled a heavy black metal credit card from her wallet, making sure everyone in line could see Ethan's name printed in silver on the front. She handed it to the young cashier with a haughty flip of her blonde hair. The cashier swiped the heavy metal card through the point-of-sale system. The machine sat silently for a long, tense moment, processing the transaction over the network. Then it emitted a loud, sharp beep. The digital screen flashed a bright warning red. The cashier looked at the screen, then handed the black card back to Vanessa with a polite but firm apologetic smile. He told her clearly that the card had been declined. Vanessa's face went completely pale. She snatched the card back, insisting loudly that the machine must be broken or that he had swiped it wrong. She loudly proclaimed to the entire quiet cafe that there was absolutely no limit on that account and demanded the cashier try inserting the chip instead. The cashier politely inserted the gold chip into the bottom of the reader. The machine beeped again, even louder this time, displaying a clear text message that the account was frozen by the issuing bank. Her friends shifted uncomfortably, exchanging confused, embarrassed glances with one another. Vanessa frantically dug through her purse looking for another form of payment, her hands trembling with sudden humiliation. The wealthy, untouchable facade she had been projecting just moments ago was crumbling rapidly in front of a dozen impatient local customers. Ethan's financial house of cards was finally collapsing under the weight of his massive debt, and Vanessa was standing right at ground zero. Just as Vanessa pulled out a crumpled personal credit card of her own, the heavy cafe door chimed again. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a gray business suit walked in, holding a thick stack of manila folders. He scanned the room, his eyes passing right over the panicked Vanessa and her whispering friends. He walked with absolute purpose directly toward my corner table, stepping carefully around the spilled coffee. He stopped in front of me and asked in a loud, clear voice if my name was Jillian. I nodded, maintaining my calm composure. He handed me the thick stack of papers, stating formally for the record that I had officially been served. He turned on his heel and walked out of the cafe, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Vanessa stopped fumbling with her wallet. A malicious, nasty smile crept back onto her face, restoring her false confidence. She loudly told her friends that it looked like the deadbeat wife was finally getting exactly what was coming to her. She clearly assumed the heavy papers were eviction notices or final brutal divorce decrees meant to completely ruin my life. I sat back down at the table, ignoring the sticky coffee mess, and slowly opened the legal summons. Penelope leaned in close to read over my shoulder. The document was a formal legal petition filed by Ethan's aggressive divorce lawyer. Ethan was legally demanding that the family court force me to assume full responsibility for exactly half of the $200,000 home equity line of credit he had secretly taken out against my house. The sheer audacity of his legal demand was breathtaking. He had forged my signature to steal $200,000 from our shared home equity. He had spent every single cent of that money on luxury items, vacations, and rent for his mistress. Now that the bank was demanding repayment and his accounts were officially frozen, He was trying to legally force me to pay back $100,000 of the very money he stole. He had explicitly written in the sworn petition that I had incurred the massive debt to fund a failed business venture, and that he was merely the innocent victim of my extreme financial irresponsibility. I read the blatant lies printed on the official court documents. Ethan thought this was his ultimate masterstroke. He thought he was trapping me in a mountain of insurmountable debt, ensuring I would spend the next decade working multiple jobs just to pay for his infidelity. He truly believed he was burying me alive under the weight of his own financial crimes. I looked up from the papers. Vanessa was finally walking out of the cafe with her friends carrying the drinks she had been forced to pay for with her own meager credit limit. She shot me one last look of absolute triumph through the glass windows before disappearing down the busy city street. Penelope looked at me, her eyes wide with total disbelief at the fabricated court documents. She asked me what on earth we were going to do about this insane, malicious demand. I folded the summons neatly and placed it safely into my dry leather bag. I told Penelope we were going to do exactly what Ethan wanted. We were going to go to the mandatory pretrial mediation. We were going to let him present his fake spreadsheets and his arrogant demands to the mediator. We were going to let him dig a hole so incredibly deep he would never be able to climb out. I smiled a genuine relaxed smile as I wiped the last drop of coffee from the table. The trap was perfectly set, and my husband had just eagerly handed me the shovel. The mandatory pretrial mediation took place 3 days later in a sterile, windowless conference room on the 4th floor of the County Family Court building. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. I sat on one side of a long faux wood table with my hands folded neatly in my lap, wearing a simple navy blue blazer and modest slacks. Harrison sat beside me, organizing a few sparse file folders to make it look as though we had very little evidence to present. The heavy wooden door opened, and Ethan walked in, followed closely by his aggressive divorce attorney. Ethan was wearing a sharp, tailored suit that I knew he had not fully paid for. Despite the fact that his bank accounts were currently frozen and his credit cards were declining across the city, he walked into that mediation room with the swagger of a victorious king. He completely ignored me, pulling out his chair and sitting down with a loud, exaggerated sigh, as if my very presence was an exhausting burden he was graciously tolerating. The court-appointed mediator, a soft-spoken woman named Diane, sat at the head of the table. She explained the rules of the mediation, stating that the goal today was to reach a mutually agreeable settlement regarding our assets and debts before dragging this mess in front of a judge. She emphasized that mediation was a space for honesty and compromise. Ethan did not waste a single second. He immediately leaned forward and launched into a performance worthy of a daytime television award. He placed a thick stack of printed color-coded spreadsheets right in the middle of the table. He looked at the mediator with an expression of profound manufactured sadness and claimed that he was the absolute victim of a financially abusive marriage. I sat in perfect silence, listening as my husband spun a web of lies, so intricate it was almost impressive. He pointed to a red column on his fabricated spreadsheet and told the mediator that the $200,000 home equity line of credit was a desperate last resort. He claimed he had to secretly take out that loan because of my uncontrollable shopping addiction. He spun a tragic tale about how I spent my days sitting in our expensive Beacon Hill home ordering designer clothes online and racking up massive hidden credit card bills, while he worked 80-hour weeks to keep our heads above water. He did not stop there. He decided to drag my career into his fictional tragedy. He gestured toward me with a look of condescending pity and told the mediator about my failed business hobby. He spoke about my graphic design work as if it were a childish delusion. He claimed that I had recklessly drained our marital savings trying to fund a pathetic little startup that never generated a single dollar of profit. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Every word out of his mouth was a deliberate projection of his own financial crimes. He was the one who had drained our savings. He was the one funding a lavish lifestyle for his 25-year-old mistress. But here in this sterile room, he painted himself as the hardworking martyr chained to a lazy, incompetent wife. To reinforce his narrative, Ethan launched into an arrogant monologue that exposed exactly how little he thought of my intelligence. He complained to the mediator that he had spent the last 7 years trying to teach me basic financial literacy. He claimed I did not understand simple contract law profit margins or compound interest. He said that leaving me in charge of a checking account was like handing a loaded weapon to a toddler. He spoke about me as if I lacked the mental capacity to comprehend the very papers sitting on the table in front of us. It took every ounce of my willpower to keep my expression completely blank. Sitting next to me, Harrison was furiously taking notes, but I could see the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. We both knew that the woman Ethan was currently mocking for failing to understand basic business principles was actually the sole founder and chief executive officer of a highly profitable educational technology company. Ethan was happily digging his own grave with every arrogant word he spoke. Then came the grand finale of his performance. Ethan leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and delivered his generous offer. He told the mediator that despite my horrific financial abuse, he was willing to let me walk away without paying him alimony. He claimed that because he was such a magnanimous person, he would not go after my future meager earnings from whatever freelance flyers I managed to design. All I had to do, Ethan stated with a benevolent smile, was accept full responsibility for exactly half of the $200,000 debt. $100,000. He framed it as a massive favor, saving me from the crushing cost of a lengthy court battle. The mediator looked over at our side of the table, her expression full of professional sympathy. She clearly believed Ethan's performance. She asked Harrison if we had a counteroffer, or if we were willing to accept these terms to avoid litigation. This was the exact moment Harrison earned every single dollar of his exorbitant legal retainer. Harrison slumped his shoulders, letting out a heavy, defeated sigh. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, playing the role of a completely outmatched attorney, advising a destitute client. He looked at me with a perfectly crafted expression of pity. He turned back to the mediator, and to Ethan, dropping his voice to a tone of quiet surrender. Harrison stated that my financial situation was incredibly precarious. He admitted that I simply did not have the resources to fight a protracted legal battle against a man with Ethan's corporate backing. He played right into Ethan's ego, confirming every false belief my husband held about my supposed poverty and desperation. Ethan's chest puffed out visibly. A triumphant smirk spread across his face. He glanced at his own lawyer, silently communicating that they had completely crushed us in less than 30 minutes. But then Harrison sat up slightly straighter. He told Ethan that we would agree to walk away quietly without demanding any spousal support from Ethan's lucrative corporate salary. However, Harrison insisted there was one absolute non-negotiable condition if we were going to accept this deal today. Harrison opened his thin file folder and pulled out a single pristine document. He slid it across the table toward Ethan and his attorney. He called it an ironclad asset and debt cutoff agreement. Harrison explained the terms using simple, slow words, deliberately catering to Ethan's belief that I needed legal concepts dumbed down. He stated that because I was walking away to start a difficult new life from scratch, I needed absolute protection from any of Ethan's future financial maneuvers. The document stipulated a hard, definitive line in the sand. It legally declared that neither party could claim any right, title, or interest in any asset, wealth, or income acquired by the other party after the exact date and time that Ethan had officially filed the petition for divorce. Harrison emphasized that this was to protect my vulnerable client from being dragged back into court if Ethan decided to take out more massive loans in the future. He framed the document entirely as a desperate shield for a broke woman trying to protect her non-existent future earnings. Ethan stared at the document. I could practically see the gears grinding inside his head. He was not thinking about protecting me. He was thinking entirely about himself. He was thinking about his upcoming end-of-year corporate sales bonus, which he expected to be massive. I was thinking about the wealth he planned to build with Vanessa once he was free of me. He wanted to make absolutely certain that the woman he was throwing away could never come back and claim a single percentage of his future millions. His greed was a living, breathing thing in the room. The idea of permanently locking me out of his future financial success was simply too intoxicating for him to resist. Ethan's lawyer, a sharp man named Donald, reached out and put his hand over the document. Donald frowned, scanning the paragraphs quickly. He told Ethan that they needed to slow down. Donald stated that it was highly unusual to sign a hard cut-off agreement during a preliminary mediation without conducting a full formal discovery of all current hidden assets. He warned Ethan that this document would completely waive his right to investigate any wealth I might acquire immediately after the divorce filing date. Ethan let out a loud, irritated scoff. He actually rolled his eyes at his own attorney. He looked at Donald and loudly pointed out that I had exactly $14 in my checking account and a broken laptop to my name. He asked his lawyer why on earth they would waste billable hours investigating the future assets of a failed graphic designer who could barely afford bus fare. Donald tried to protest again, warning that signing legally binding cutoff agreements without a thorough review of the fine print was a massive strategic risk. He pulled the paper closer to his side of the table, insisting they take it back to the office to review the specific clauses regarding corporate acquisitions and trust disbursements. Ethan was entirely blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to secure a total victory today. He did not want to wait. He wanted to walk out of this building knowing he had legally severed all financial ties, protecting his precious upcoming bonus from the woman he despised. He physically reached over and yanked the document out from under his lawyer's hand. He told Donald to shut up and back off, stating that he was paying the legal bills, and he made the decisions. He pulled a heavy luxury fountain pen from the inside pocket of his tailored suit. Ethan looked across the table directly into my eyes. His expression was a mixture of absolute victory and pure malice. He told me that this was the very last time I would ever get to ride his coattails. He said he was looking forward to watching me fail in the real world without his wallet to catch me. Without pausing to read a single line of the dense legal text detailing the waiver of rights to independent LLCs and isolated trust accounts, Ethan eagerly pressed his gold pen to the paper. He signed his name with a wide, aggressive flourish, desperate to finalize his triumph. He had absolutely no idea that his arrogant signature had just legally locked him out of $15 million. Ethan enthusiastically capped his gold fountain pen and tossed it onto the table with a loud clatter. He leaned back and laced his hands behind his head, looking at the mediator with an expression of immense self-satisfaction. He truly believed he had just executed the most brilliant financial maneuver of his entire life. The mediator carefully collected the signed copies of the asset and debt cutoff agreement, checking to ensure all the signatures and dates were properly affixed. She placed the official court seal on the pages and handed a copy to each attorney. Harrison took our copy and slipped it into his briefcase with smooth, practiced efficiency. He did not smile. He did not show a single ounce of triumph. He maintained the perfect facade of a lawyer who had just been forced to swallow a bitter defeat for the sake of his destitute client. The mediator formally concluded the session, thanking us all for our time and cooperation. I stood up, gathered my purse, and pushed my chair in. I walked toward the heavy wooden door of the conference room, feeling a profound sense of lightness spreading through my chest. The trap had sprung shut and the lock had just clicked into place. We filed out of the windowless room and stepped into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courthouse hallway. The corridor was mostly empty, echoing with the distant sound of ringing telephones and hurried footsteps. Ethan immediately sped up his pace, purposefully cutting in front of me to block my path to the elevator banks. He was not satisfied with simply winning on paper. His narcissistic ego demanded that he revel in his perceived victory and grind my face into the dirt one last time. He turned around to face me, blocking the hallway with his broad shoulders. A cruel, victorious grin stretched across his face. He looked me up and down, taking in my simple navy blazer and modest slacks with a look of absolute disgust. He told me that I was an absolute fool for bringing a cut-rate lawyer to a negotiation against him. He bragged loudly, his voice bouncing off the marble walls, ensuring that everyone in the vicinity could hear him. He boasted that he had just legally locked me out of his massive end-of-year corporate bonus. He claimed the bonus alone was going to be worth more than I had earned in my entire pathetic life. Ethan leaned in closer, invading my personal space. He told me that he and Vanessa were going to use that bonus to buy a summer house in the Hamptons. He sneered, telling me that while he was drinking champagne on a ski slope, I could enjoy living in a damp cardboard box under a highway overpass. He said it was exactly what a lazy, untalented woman like me deserved for trying to drag a successful man down to her level. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked directly into his arrogant eyes and felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. I let him finish his venomous rant. I let him bask in the illusion of his ultimate triumph for just a few seconds longer. Then I tilted my head slightly and asked him a very simple question. I kept my voice quiet and perfectly steady. I asked Ethan how his latest internal corporate sales audit was going. Ethan stopped mid-laugh. His smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second before he quickly masked it with irritation. He brushed the question off with a harsh wave of his hand, telling me I was speaking absolute nonsense. He accused me of being desperate and trying to change the subject because I was so humiliated by my total financial defeat. He turned his back on me and pressed the call button for the elevator. But behind him, his attorney Donald had stopped dead in his tracks. Donald was not paying attention to Ethan's childish bragging. Donald was staring intently at the carbon copy of the asset and debt cutoff agreement he held in his hands. The sharp, experienced lawyer was reading the fine print that his arrogant client had refused to review. I watched the exact moment the realization hit him. The color completely drained from Donald's face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly ill. Donald looked up from the paper, his eyes darting frantically between Harrison and me. He looked at the date and timestamp stamped clearly on the bottom of the agreement. He read the specific phrasing out loud, his voice trembling slightly. He read the clause stating that neither party could claim any right, title, or interest in any asset, wealth, or income acquired by the other party after the exact date and time of the divorce filing. Donald stepped forward, completely ignoring his client. He looked directly at Harrison and demanded to know exactly what we were hiding. He asked point blank why Harrison had insisted on that highly specific chronological cutoff language. Harrison finally let the facade drop. He stopped playing the defeated lawyer and allowed a sharp, predatory smile to spread across his face. He calmly buttoned his suit jacket and looked at opposing counsel with the confidence of a grandmaster calling checkmate. Harrison explained the timeline flawlessly. He told Donald that my educational technology platform had recently caught the attention of a major international educational conglomerate. He stated that the acquisition contracts had been sitting fully negotiated on my desk for an entire week. Harrison spelled out the brilliant trap we had laid. He explained that I had intentionally delayed adding my final signature to the acquisition documents. I had waited patiently for our anniversary dinner. I had waited for Ethan to proudly and aggressively file the petition for divorce. I had let Ethan establish the absolute legal cutoff date of our marriage. Exactly 48 hours after Ethan threw those divorce papers onto my dinner plate, I signed the corporate buyout. The $15 million cash payout cleared directly into my isolated premarital trust account. Harrison looked at Donald and delivered the fatal blow. He explained that because the limited liability company was originally funded 100% by my late father's inheritance, it was already protected non-marital property. But the massive $15 million liquid cash payout was a newly acquired asset that materialized completely after the divorce filing date. By aggressively signing the cutoff agreement today, Ethan had just legally, permanently, and voluntarily renounced his right to ever discover, audit, or claim a single penny of my $15 million. Donald stared at Harrison in absolute horrified silence. The veteran attorney realized he had just let his client sign away millions of dollars because Ethan was too blinded by his own arrogance to listen to legal counsel. Donald looked at Ethan with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Ethan had been half listening to the exchange while waiting for the elevator. He turned around, his brow furrowed in confusion. He was too dense to fully grasp the sophisticated legal maneuver that had just destroyed him. He looked at his lawyer and then at me, letting out a loud, forced laugh. He accused us of making up a fake company to try and scare him. He told Donald to stop listening to our pathetic, desperate lies, claiming I was just a broke freelancer trying to save face in the hallway. I did not bother correcting him. I did not need to convince him of my wealth. The courts and the banking institutions would do that for me in due time. I just stood there watching the man who had tormented me for years, happily clinging to his sinking ship. A loud chime echoed through the corridor as the heavy metal elevator doors slid open. Ethan turned to step inside, still shaking his head and muttering about my pathetic delusions. He was entirely convinced he had won the day. Just as his leather shoe crossed the threshold into the elevator, his cell phone began to ring loudly from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Ethan paused, pulling the phone out and glancing at the caller identification screen. A look of mild confusion crossed his face. He pressed the button to accept the call and held the phone to his ear, answering with a smug, confident greeting. The hallway was quiet enough that I could clearly hear the sharp, authoritative voice speaking on the other end of the line. It was not a client. It was not a sales prospect. It was the head of his corporate human resources department. The voice on the phone did not offer polite greetings or casual pleasantries. The executive bluntly informed Ethan that he needed to report to the corporate headquarters immediately. The voice stated that a formal high-level investigation had just been launched into his recent corporate expense reports. The Human Resources Director explicitly mentioned that the company auditors had discovered massive unapproved expenditures and highly suspicious luxury trips taken alongside his junior subordinate Vanessa. Ethan froze completely. His hand gripped the cell phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. The smug, arrogant smile melted off his face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The elevator doors began to close automatically, but he did not move to stop them. He just stood there, staring blankly ahead, as the doors slid shut, cutting off his panicked, stuttering excuses, leaving Harrison and me standing victorious in the quiet hallway. Harrison and I knew exactly what awaited Ethan at his corporate headquarters. The forensic timeline we later submitted to the judge detailed his spectacular downfall minute by agonizing minute. When those elevator doors closed at the courthouse, Ethan was still desperately trying to convince himself that the phone call was just a routine administrative check. He drove his leased luxury sedan directly to the glass and steel tower that housed his company, oblivious to the fact that his entire professional reputation was already in ashes. When Ethan stepped off the executive elevator, he was not greeted by his usual administrative staff. Instead, two unsmiling corporate security guards immediately escorted him away from his corner office and directly into a windowless human resources boardroom. Sitting across the long mahogany table were the Vice President of Human Resources and the Chief Financial Officer. They did not offer him a seat. They simply slid a massive three-ring binder across the polished wood surface. The binder contained hundreds of pages of flagged expense reports, itemized hotel receipts from Aspen and Miami, and time-stamped photographs of Vanessa accompanying him on what were supposed to be solo client acquisition trips. Ethan tried to use his trademark sales charm to talk his way out of the room. He flashed his handsome smile and attempted to wave away the discrepancies as simple accounting errors caused by a busy travel schedule. The chief financial officer cut him off instantly. He informed Ethan that misappropriating corporate funds to finance a romantic affair with a junior subordinate was a severe violation of his employment contract. Ethan was formally stripped of his title and suspended without pay, effective immediately pending a final forensic audit. The security guards confiscated his corporate credit cards, his building access badge, and his company-issued phone right there on the spot. They marched him out through the busy main lobby, while dozens of his colleagues watched in stunned silence. Ethan was left standing on the rainy sidewalk, completely stripped of the corporate armor he used to intimidate everyone around him. He walked to his car and sat heavily in the leather driver's seat. The reality of his financial situation finally began to crash down on him with crushing force. He pulled out his personal phone and opened his banking application, hoping to find some hidden reserve of cash to hire a defense attorney. He stared at the glaring red notifications on his screen. His accounts were entirely frozen by the family court order. He had no access to his salary. The $200,000 he had stolen from my house equity was completely gone. He had blown every single cent of that fraudulent loan on things that held absolutely zero liquid value. He had spent the money on first-class plane tickets, expensive dinners, tailored suits, and a completely unnecessary luxury sports car lease. His phone chimed with an automated email from the auto finance company, warning him that his upcoming lease payment would be returned for insufficient funds. He was a man who measured his entire worth by his bank balance, and his balance was currently negative. Desperate and panicking, Ethan drove back to the Beacon Hill house. He had illegally changed the locks to keep me out, but the house was still filled with the expensive items he had purchased over the last few months. He walked through the heavy front door and found Vanessa sitting on the custom velvet sofa in the living room. She was casually scrolling through a luxury shopping website on her phone. Around her neck sparkled a $15,000 diamond tennis necklace. It was the exact piece of jewelry Ethan had purchased for her just 3 weeks ago using the stolen home equity money. Ethan rushed into the room, shedding his wet coat. He did not bother greeting her affectionately. He frantically explained the situation, telling her about the sudden corporate suspension, the frozen bank accounts, and the looming threat of the mortgage payment being rejected. He paced back and forth across the hardwood floor, running his hands through his hair as he laid out the grim reality of their immediate future. He stopped in front of Vanessa and held out his hand. He told her that he needed her to take off the diamond necklace right now. He explained that he knew a discreet high-end jeweler downtown who would buy the piece back for cash. He said they needed the money immediately to keep the lights on and pay for a ruthless defense lawyer to fight the corporate fraud charges. Vanessa slowly lowered her phone. She did not look at him with sympathy. She did not stand up to comfort the man she supposedly loved. She looked at his outstretched hand and then up at his desperate face with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Her upper lip curled into a nasty sneer. She physically recoiled from him, pressing her hand protectively over the glittering diamonds at her throat. She raised her voice, shattering the quiet of the large house. She screamed that she absolutely refused to hand over her jewelry to pay for his stupid mistakes. She yelled that the necklace was a gift, and she was not running a charity for unemployed men. Ethan stared at her in absolute shock, his arms still extended. He begged her to understand that this was a temporary crisis, and that they needed to act as a team to survive the month. Vanessa let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. She stood up from the sofa, her eyes flashing with venomous entitlement. She told Ethan in no uncertain terms that she did not sign up to play house with a broke man. She reminded him that he had promised her a life of luxury private jets and a summer home in the Hamptons. She furiously pointed out that without his corporate black card and his executive salary, he was nothing but a pathetic middle manager who got caught stealing from his own company. She threatened that if he ever asked her to sell her belongings to cover his debts again, she would pack her bags and leave him sitting alone in an empty house. Ethan stood paralyzed in the center of the living room, listening to her footsteps stomp angrily up the wooden stairs. The rapid deterioration of their relationship was a brutal awakening for him. In that agonizing moment, the stark reality of his choices slammed into him. Vanessa's loyalty was purely transactional, bought and paid for with stolen money. Her affection ended the exact second the funding dried up. A painful memory forced its way into Ethan's mind, contrasting sharply with the vicious woman upstairs. He remembered a time 10 years ago when he was just a struggling junior salesman who had lost his biggest client. He had come home to our tiny rented apartment absolutely devastated and terrified he would be fired. I did not scream at him. I did not call him a failure. I held him on our cheap futon and told him we would eat rice and beans for a year if we had to. I had secretly taken on a third freelance design contract, working until 3 in the morning every night, just so I could buy him a new tailored suit for his next interview. I had built him up when he had nothing. I had supported his dreams with my own sweat and exhaustion. I loved the man while Vanessa only loved the money. Left entirely alone in the silent foyer, desperation began to choke the air from Ethan's lungs. The walls of the expensive house felt like they were closing in on him. He needed cash today. He needed a way to fight back against the corporate lawyers and Harrison's relentless legal maneuvers. A sudden frantic thought struck him. He remembered the heavy panel in the basement utility room. Over the course of our marriage, Ethan had secretly purchased 3 vintage luxury watches, hiding them down there as his own private emergency fund. He had never told me about them, believing he was brilliantly hiding assets from his naive wife. If he could pawn those watches, he could easily walk away with $50,000 in untraceable cash. He sprinted down the basement stairs, taking them 2 at a time. The basement was dark and smelled faintly of damp concrete. He rushed to the back corner, threw aside the old moving boxes, and yanked back the false floor panel. He dropped to his knees and punched his secret six-digit code into the electronic keypad of the steel safe. The green light flashed and the heavy metal bolts retracted with a solid mechanical thud. Ethan eagerly pulled the heavy door open and reached his hands into the dark interior, expecting to feel the smooth, polished wood of the luxury watch boxes. His hands grasped empty air. He frantically patted the bottom of the steel box, feeling around the cold metal corners. The watches were completely gone. I had found them months ago while searching for our tax documents and had immediately relocated them to a secure bank vault under Harrison's legal guidance. Ethan let out a breathless sound of pure panic. He blindly swept his hand across the back of the empty safe. His fingers brushed against a thick manila envelope sitting flat against the bottom panel. He pulled the envelope out into the dim basement light, his chest heaving with exertion. He flipped the metal clasp open and slid a stack of official state tax registry documents out of the folder. He stared at the thick white paper, trying to comprehend what he was looking at. The primary document was a certified articles of organization for a limited liability company. The registration date was stamped 5 years ago. He moved his eyes down the page to the section listing the sole registered owner and principal executive officer. The name printed in bold black ink was Jillian. Ethan stopped breathing. He flipped to the second page, staring at the initial capitalization records and the corporate identification numbers. He had spent years mocking my career, telling his friends that I colored for a living. He had completely dismissed my work as a pathetic hobby. But holding this official corporate document in his trembling hands, a new desperate realization washed over him. I did not just have a hobby. I had a fully registered corporate entity. A dark, malicious idea began to form in his panicked mind. If I had a hidden company, then it was legally a marital asset. If it was a marital asset, he could demand that the family court seize it. He smiled a desperate, manic smile alone in the damp basement. He believed he had just found the ultimate weapon to destroy me and pay off all his debts at the exact same time. He had absolutely no idea that he was staring at the bait for a trap that would finalize his total ruin. Ethan scrambled up the wooden basement stairs, clutching the manila envelope against his chest like a winning lottery ticket. His breath came in ragged, greedy gasps. He did not bother calling his attorney Donald. Donald had proven himself to be a weak, overly cautious coward during the mediation session, and Ethan had absolutely no patience left for legal technicalities. He was running purely on the toxic adrenaline of his supposed brilliant discovery. He firmly believed he had just uncovered the ultimate smoking gun that would shift the entire divorce in his favor. He rushed out to his leased sports car, tossing the damp basement documents onto the passenger seat. He drove recklessly through the slick Boston streets, heading straight for the county family court building. He marched into the clerk's office, bypassing the usual attorney filing channels, and demanded the forms for an emergency ex parte motion. He grabbed a pen and began filling out the legal documents with aggressive, jagged handwriting. In his sworn petition, Ethan blatantly lied to the court. He formally demanded that the judge immediately freeze, seize, and liquidate my hidden corporate entity. He claimed that I had maliciously concealed marital assets and that my secret company must be sold off piece by piece to satisfy the $200,000 debt he insisted I had caused. He did not care that he was committing perjury. He only cared about forcing me to my knees. The moment the court clerk stamped his emergency filing, Ethan stepped away from the counter and pulled his cell phone from his pocket. He stood in the busy courthouse lobby and snapped a harsh, poorly lit photograph of the freshly stamped motion resting directly on top of my corporate registration papers. He attached the image to a text message and began typing furiously. I was sitting across from Harrison in his corner office, finalizing the secure routing numbers for my trust account, when my phone buzzed against the glass table. I unlocked the screen and opened the message from my husband. Ethan had written a long, rambling paragraph dripping with absolute venom. He bragged that he had found my secret little stash hidden in the basement safe. He mocked my pathetic attempt to play businesswoman behind his back. He typed that he was going to burn my little startup to the absolute ground. I explicitly stated that he was going to enjoy sitting in the courtroom, watching the judge sell off my crayons and flyer templates for pennies on the dollar just to pay for the luxury trips he took with Vanessa. He ended the message by telling me that my game was over and I had officially lost everything. I did not gasp. I did not panic. I simply read the vicious text message twice to ensure I fully grasped the magnitude of his strategic blunder. I slid my phone across the smooth glass desk toward my attorney. Harrison adjusted his glasses and read the message. He looked at the photograph of the pro se court filing, and a slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair and let out a deep, booming laugh that echoed off the office walls. Harrison shook his head in pure disbelief. He explained that by bypassing his own lawyer and filing this aggressive motion himself, Ethan had just walked blindly into a fatal legal ambush. Ethan had voluntarily dragged the very entity he had just signed his rights away from back into the active court record, but on completely false and malicious pretenses. Harrison picked up a pen and looked at me with sharp professional intensity. He asked if I wanted him to immediately file a protective motion to block Ethan's aggressive request and have it dismissed based on the cutoff agreement we had already signed. I looked out the window at the gray city sky and shook my head slowly. I told Harrison not to block a single thing. I instructed him to actively encourage the motion and ensure it was scheduled for a highly public open court hearing. I wanted Ethan to stand confidently in front of a judge on the public record and loudly demand half of the company he had spent 7 years actively ridiculing. Ethan's pure, unadulterated malice was his defining characteristic. He did not just want to survive his current corporate suspension and his mounting financial crisis. He wanted to completely break my spirit. He assumed my company was completely worthless, maybe valued at a few $1,000s at absolute best. He wanted to liquidate it anyway, just to hurt me. He wanted to take away my toys and destroy my passions simply to prove he held absolute dominant power over my existence. Harrison nodded, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a flawless courtroom slaughter. He began drafting a response that would eagerly welcome Ethan's motion, setting the stage for the most brutal financial revelation in the history of the county family court. While we finalized our trap, Ethan's personal life continued its spectacular downward spiral. The news of his sudden suspension and security escort out of his corporate headquarters had spread through the industry gossip channels like wildfire. It did not take long for the scandalous details to reach the one person who cared about Ethan's social standing even more than he did. Later that afternoon, I was walking out of Harrison's office building and stepping onto the busy downtown sidewalk when my phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed an unknown number, but the second I accepted the call, I recognized the sharp, demanding tone instantly. It was Patricia. My mother-in-law sounded completely unhinged. The aristocratic, polished facade she always wore had completely evaporated. She was speaking in rapid, frantic sentences, her breath catching in her throat. She had just found out about Ethan's corporate suspension and the freezing of his bank accounts. She was in an absolute state of panic, realizing that the financial foundation supporting her country club lifestyle was currently collapsing. Patricia did not ask how I was doing. She did not apologize for ambushing me at the diner with a measly $5,000 bribe. She immediately demanded that we meet at a neutral location right this second. I kept walking down the sidewalk, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement. I told her I was far too busy managing my own affairs to meet with her. Patricia dropped her voice into a low, menacing whisper that vibrated through the phone speaker. She thought she still held the upper hand. She thought I was terrified of losing my newly discovered business. She told me she knew all about the emergency court motion Ethan had just filed against my little graphic design company. She threatened me, stating she had the power and the influence to make Ethan drop the entire legal attack before it reached a judge. She promised she could save my worthless passion project from being liquidated and sold off for scrap. But she warned me with a desperate, greedy edge to her voice that her maternal intervention was going to cost me a very steep price. I did not hang up the phone immediately. I listened to Patricia breathing heavily through the speaker. Her desperate threat about charging me a steep price to save my company hung in the cold city air. I stopped walking and looked up at the towering glass facade of the legal building where Harrison worked. I told Patricia exactly where I was standing. I said if she wanted to negotiate the fate of my company, she could come meet me on the sidewalk right now. I ended the call and slipped my phone into my pocket. I only had to wait 15 minutes. A silver luxury sedan pulled up sharply to the curb. Patricia practically fell out of the passenger seat. She was not the perfectly composed aristocratic matriarch who had ambushed me at the diner just a few days ago. Her hair was slightly disheveled. She was wearing a trench coat that looked hastily thrown on over casual clothes. The absolute panic radiating from her was impossible to hide. She rushed up to me on the crowded sidewalk, her heels clicking frantically against the concrete. I expected her to launch into a vicious tirade or double down on her threats to destroy my graphic design business. Instead, her entire demeanor shifted the second we were face to face. The haughty predator vanished. In her place stood a terrified older woman who realized her entire world was collapsing. She reached out and tried to grab my hands. I took a deliberate step back, refusing to let her touch me. Patricia let her hands drop to her sides and actually began to beg. She pleaded with me to listen to reason. She said she knew Ethan had made some terrible mistakes with the home equity loan. She admitted that $200,000 was a massive amount of money, but she insisted that I was the only one who could fix this mess. She looked around at the passing pedestrians and lowered her voice to a desperate whisper. She begged me to go into the mediation records and formally accept full responsibility for the fraudulent debt. She promised that if I took the financial hit, she would make sure Ethan dropped his emergency motion against my company. Then she looked at me with tear-filled eyes and delivered the most hypocritical line I had ever heard. She said I needed to do this because family protects family. I stared at her, letting the absolute absurdity of her words sink in. Family protects family. This was the same woman who had spent the last 7 years reminding me at every single holiday dinner that I lacked the proper pedigree to be a true member of her household. As she continued to plead, her desperate rambling began to expose the dark, ugly truth behind her pristine country club facade. Patricia confessed that she completely relied on Ethan's executive salary and corporate bonuses to maintain her own lavish lifestyle. She admitted that her massive suburban estate was heavily mortgaged and her credit cards were entirely maxed out. She had been living far beyond her means for decades, using her son's income to fund her expensive social club memberships and designer wardrobes. With Ethan suspended without pay and his accounts frozen by the court, Patricia was entirely cut off. She told me she was terrified of losing her home. She was even more terrified of her wealthy friends discovering that she was completely broke. Her entire aristocratic identity was a fragile illusion built entirely on a mountain of suffocating debt. I stood on the bustling sidewalk watching her unravel. I remembered how she had mocked my middle-class roots. I remembered how she had sneered at my freelance work, claiming I had no ambition. She had judged my worth based on my lack of designer clothes and expensive cars. Yet my foundation was built on solid, relentless hard work and careful saving. Her foundation was nothing but a house of cards, financed by a son who was willing to commit federal bank fraud just to keep up appearances. Patricia wiped a tear from her cheek and asked me if we had a deal. She truly believed her emotional performance would trigger my empathy. She thought I was still the quiet, eager-to-please daughter-in-law who would gladly sacrifice her own well-being to keep the peace. I did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen and opened an audio file I had saved to my favorites folder. I turned the volume all the way up and held the phone between us. The crystal-clear audio recording began to play loudly over the noise of the city traffic. It was not a recording of Ethan. It was a recording I had discreetly captured on my phone while sitting in that cheap diner just a few days ago. Patricia's own sharp, arrogant voice echoed from the small speaker. The recording played her exact words, offering me a $5,000 bribe to quietly disappear. Then the audio delivered the final devastating blow. Patricia's recorded voice stated clearly and maliciously that she always knew my middle-class roots would drag her son down. The recording captured her explicitly saying that I was never a real part of their family. I stopped the audio and slipped the phone back into my bag. I looked at Patricia, whose face had drained of all color. She was staring at me with her mouth open, completely paralyzed by the sound of her own cruelty. I told Patricia that she was absolutely right about one thing. I agreed that I was never a part of her family. I told her that I would rather lose every single thing I owned than take on a penny of her son's fraudulent debt. Patricia began to stutter, trying to backtrack and claim the recording was taken out of context. She tried to say she was just angry that morning and did not mean those hurtful things. I cut her off immediately. I kept my voice icy and professional. I informed her that she should not worry about the context of the recording because the federal authorities would figure it out for themselves. I told her that the $5,000 check she threw at me was not torn up or thrown away. I explained that I had walked straight from the diner to my lawyer's office and submitted her personal check into a secure legal evidence vault. I watched the realization hit her. I told her the check and the non-disclosure agreement she tried to force me to sign were now official exhibits of financial coercion and witness tampering. I explained that attempting to bribe a spouse to waive alimony while threatening professional blacklisting was a severe legal offense. Patricia physically stumbled backward, her knees buckling slightly. She leaned against the cold stone wall of the legal building for support. The aristocratic pride she had clung to for her entire life completely shattered. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob uncontrollably right there on the public sidewalk. She cried for her lost reputation, her impending bankruptcy, and the total destruction of her family's false image. She was crying because she finally realized there was no way out. I did not feel a shred of guilt watching her cry. I simply stood there observing the natural consequences of her own malicious behavior. Just as Patricia's sobs grew louder, the heavy glass doors of the law firm pushed open. Harrison stepped out onto the sidewalk looking impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit. He carried a crisp manila folder in his hands. He did not look surprised to see Patricia crying against the building. He had been watching the entire exchange through the lobby windows, waiting for the perfect moment to intervene. Harrison walked directly up to Patricia. He did not offer her a tissue. He did not ask if she was all right. He simply reached into his folder and pulled out a thick, legally binding document stamped with the official seal of the county court. He held the document out to her, forcing her to lower her hands and look at it. Patricia stared at the paper, her tear-streaked face trembling with fresh terror. She refused to take it, so Harrison simply tucked the document firmly under her folded arm, ensuring she was legally served. Harrison spoke with absolute ruthless professionalism. He informed Patricia that the document was a formal subpoena. He stated clearly that her son Ethan was currently being formally charged with felony forgery regarding the $200,000 home equity line of credit. Patricia let out a soft, horrified gasp, but Harrison did not stop. He looked her directly in the eyes and delivered the final hook. Harrison told Patricia that because she had intimately benefited from Ethan's stolen funds, and because she had actively attempted to coerce a key witness with a financial bribe, she was being officially called to testify under oath. He stated that she would be forced to take the stand in open court and answer for her son's financial crimes, as well as her own complicity. He advised her to hire a very good criminal defense attorney immediately. Harrison turned to me, gesturing politely toward the glass doors. We left Patricia weeping hysterically on the pavement, clutching her subpoena as her entire world burned to the ground. The heavy oak doors of the county family court swung shut, sealing us inside a courtroom that smelled of old wood and nervous sweat. I sat at the plaintiff table next to Harrison, maintaining a posture of absolute calm while waiting for the proceedings to officially commence. Across the wide aisle, Ethan sat beside his attorney Donald, looking incredibly arrogant. Despite being newly suspended from his corporate job and drowning in massive debt, Ethan still wore a smug expression. He straightened his expensive tie and leaned back in his chair, clearly believing that his luck was about to change. He thought today was the day he would force me to shoulder the burden of his financial crimes. The judge, a stern older man with sharp eyes, called the final divorce hearing to order. Donald immediately stood up and launched into a deeply rehearsed opening statement. He aggressively pushed the narrative that the $200,000 home equity line of credit was a standard marital debt. Donald paced in front of the judge, dramatically waving a stack of fabricated expense reports. He claimed that the massive loan was taken out solely to cover our exorbitant marital living expenses and to fund my supposedly failed graphic design business. Donald explicitly demanded that the court force me to pay exactly $100,000 to alleviate the financial hardship his client was currently suffering. Ethan watched his lawyer perform with a look of pure entitlement. He actually turned his head and shot me a triumphant wink across the room. I was entirely convinced that because my name was printed on the bank loan documents, the judge would automatically split the debt right down the middle. I expected me to walk out of this courthouse completely ruined, spending the next decade working multiple grueling minimum wage jobs just to pay off the money he had used to buy diamond necklaces for his mistress. I did not break eye contact with my husband for a single second. I just waited for Harrison to stand up. When Donald finished his aggressive demands, Harrison slowly rose from his leather chair. He did not raise his voice. He did not object to Donald's characterization of my spending habits. Instead, Harrison calmly approached the bench and handed the judge a sealed evidence folder. Harrison stated for the public record that we completely rejected the assertion that the $200,000 debt was a shared marital obligation. I informed the court that we had absolute proof the loan was obtained through malicious and deliberate financial fraud. The entire courtroom grew incredibly quiet. Ethan's smug smile faltered slightly, but he quickly forced it back into place, trying to look unbothered. Harrison turned to the gallery and called our first witness to the stand. A neatly dressed woman walked down the center aisle and took the oath. Harrison introduced her as a federally certified handwriting analyst with over 20 years of experience in forensic document examination. Harrison placed a large presentation board on an easel facing the judge. On the board were two highly magnified digital photographs. The first image was my actual signature taken from my driver license and my passport. The second image was the signature located at the bottom of the home equity loan agreement. The expert witness methodically broke down the undeniable discrepancies between the two samples. She pointed out the aggressive slant, the improper looping of the vowels, and the heavy pen pressure that completely contradicted my natural writing style. She testified under oath that it was a blatant and amateurish forgery. Donald jumped up and shouted an objection. He claimed that a handwriting analysis was subjective and that spouses often sign documents for one another with verbal permission. He argued that Ethan simply signed the paper because I was too busy with my failed projects to go to the bank myself. Harrison smiled a cold, sharp smile. He told the judge that verbal permission was entirely impossible because on the exact date and time the loan was executed, I was not even in the state of Massachusetts. Harrison submitted flight records and hospital visitor logs proving that I was in Ohio, caring for my sick aunt, recovering from surgery. I was 400 miles away when my husband decided to steal $200,000 from my home equity. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his heavy wooden chair. A thin sheen of sweat began to form on his forehead. The confident corporate executive facade was rapidly melting away under the harsh glare of undeniable facts. But Harrison was not finished dismantling him. Harrison told the judge that we did not need to rely solely on expert testimony or flight records. He stated that we had acquired direct visual confirmation of the crime. Harrison handed a small digital drive to the court clerk and requested that the video file be played on the courtroom monitors. The large screens mounted on the walls flickered to life. The high-definition security footage from the downtown bank branch began to play. The timestamp in the corner of the screen perfectly matched the date and time on the fraudulent loan documents. The video clearly showed Ethan walking up to the loan officer's desk completely alone. There was no audio, but the visual evidence was devastating. We watched as the bank teller handed Ethan the final contract. We watched Ethan take a pen from his suit pocket. We watched him lean over the desk and quickly forge my signature on the bottom line without a single ounce of hesitation. Harrison paused the video right as Ethan handed the forged document back to the teller. Harrison turned to Ethan and demanded that he take the witness stand to explain his actions under oath. Donald tried frantically to block the testimony, but the furious judge ordered Ethan to the stand. Ethan walked up the steps, his legs visibly trembling. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone. When Harrison asked him directly what he had told the bank teller that day, Ethan tried to stammer out a lie. He claimed he could not remember the specific conversation. Harrison reminded him that lying under oath carried severe prison time and that the bank teller had already submitted a sworn affidavit detailing the interaction. Trapped and panicking, Ethan finally broke. He sat in the witness box, wiping sweat from his face, and publicly admitted the truth. He confessed that he had looked the bank teller right in the eyes and lied. He told the teller that I was sitting outside in the car circling the block because we could not find parking. He admitted that he forged my name right there at the desk to secure the cash for his own personal use. Hearing my husband confess his financial crimes on the public record was incredibly validating. For years, he had told me I was terrible with money. He had belittled my intelligence and made me feel financially dependent on his corporate success. Now he was sitting in a courtroom exposed as a desperate common thief who had to forge his wife's name to fund his pathetic infidelity. The judge had heard enough. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down on the sounding block, the sharp crack echoing through the silent courtroom. His face was red with absolute fury. The judge looked directly at Ethan and delivered a scathing reprimand that stripped away every last ounce of my husband's dignity. The judge declared that he had zero tolerance for financial abuse and forgery in his courtroom. He formally ruled that the $200,000 debt was 100% Ethan's sole responsibility. He stated that I was completely absolved of any financial liability regarding the fraudulent home equity line of credit. Then the judge delivered the most terrifying news of all. He looked over his glasses and informed Ethan that a copy of today's court transcript and the video evidence were being immediately forwarded to the district attorney's office for formal felony fraud prosecution. Ethan sat frozen in the witness box, his entire world collapsing around him. He realized he was not just facing bankruptcy, he was looking at actual prison time. His lawyer Donald pinched the bridge of his nose and refused to even look at his client. But Ethan was a true narcissist. And a narcissist backed into a corner will always try to burn the entire room down. The sheer humiliation of being scolded like a criminal pushed him right over the edge. His face turned a deep blotchy red, and the veins in his neck bulged against his damp collar. He shot up from the witness chair, his chair scraping violently against the wood floor. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me. He screamed at the top of his lungs that he did not care about the criminal charges. He yelled that he would gladly take the $200,000 debt right now. He shouted that he was fully prepared to accept the financial burden because he had the ultimate leverage to pay it off. Ethan looked wildly at the furious judge and demanded that the court focus on my financial deception instead of his. He slammed his hand against the wooden railing and roared that I had been hiding a secret registered corporate entity from him for 5 years. He screamed that he demanded his legal 50% share of my hidden company right this very second. He frantically ordered the judge to immediately liquidate my limited liability company to the ground so he could finally get exactly what was owed to him and walk out of this courthouse as a wealthy man. The echo of Ethan's frantic demands faded into the heavy wooden rafters of the courtroom. He stood there panting slightly, his chest heaving with the exertion of his own spite. He looked incredibly proud of himself. He shot a glance over his shoulder at Vanessa, who was sitting in the second row of the public gallery. She offered him a small, tentative smile, clearly hoping this hidden company would magically produce enough cash to save them from the crushing debt they had just been assigned. Ethan turned back to face the bench, completely confident that he had just salvaged his ruined life. The judge stared down at Ethan with an expression of profound weariness. The magistrate had spent the last hour dealing with a man who had forged a signature, stolen $200,000, and lied under oath. Now this same man was screaming demands about a hidden business. The judge picked up his wooden gavel and tapped it lightly against the sounding block, demanding absolute order in his courtroom. The judge turned his sharp gaze toward the plaintiff table. He addressed Harrison, directly ignoring Ethan's erratic behavior entirely. The judge stated that since the respondent had formally raised the issue of a concealed corporate entity during an active asset division hearing, the court required immediate financial disclosure. The judge demanded to know if I was indeed the registered owner of a limited liability company, and if so, why it had not been presented during the preliminary asset discovery phase. Ethan let out a loud, triumphant scoff. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked down at me, expecting to see terror in my eyes. He thought he had caught me in a massive lie. He thought I was about to be severely reprimanded by the court for hiding money. Harrison did not flinch. He did not scramble to make excuses. He simply stood up from his leather chair, smoothed the front of his tailored suit, and offered the judge a polite, respectful nod. Harrison stated for the official public record that we had absolutely nothing to hide. He informed the court that the entity in question was a strictly non-marital asset protected by a pre-existing trust structure, but that we were more than happy to provide full transparency to the bench. Harrison reached down and opened his heavy leather briefcase. He did not pull out a single sheet of paper or a hastily printed tax return. Instead, he retrieved a massive, thick, professionally bound corporate valuation portfolio. The binder was at least 3 inches thick, stamped with the gold foil seal of one of the most prestigious forensic accounting firms on the East Coast. Harrison walked with measured, confident steps across the courtroom floor. He approached the bench and handed the heavy portfolio directly to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. Harrison informed the magistrate that this was a fully certified, comprehensive corporate valuation completed just days prior to the divorce filing. Ethan watched the exchange with a bewildered frown. The sheer physical size of the document did not compute with his narrative. In his mind, my business consisted of a few digital flyers and a battered laptop. He could not fathom why a simple freelance hobby would require a bound forensic accounting portfolio. He leaned over and whispered something to his lawyer, Donald. Donald did not respond. The veteran attorney was staring at the thick binder with a look of absolute dread, clearly realizing that Harrison was about to drop a massive financial bomb on the courtroom. The judge opened the heavy cover of the portfolio. The courtroom fell into a tense, suffocating silence. The only sound was the rustling of thick paper as the judge turned to the executive summary on the first page. We all watched the magistrate read. I watched his eyes scan the lines of text. I watched his brow furrow in deep concentration. Then the judge stopped reading completely. He took a long, slow breath. He reached up and pulled his reading glasses off his face. He pulled a small microfiber cloth from his robe pocket and meticulously cleaned the lenses. He placed the glasses back on the bridge of his nose and leaned closer to the document. He read the entire page a second time, as if he simply could not believe the numbers printed in the certified audit. The judge slowly closed the heavy portfolio. He rested his hands on top of the leather cover and looked down at Ethan. All the previous anger and irritation in the magistrate's face had completely vanished. It was replaced by a look of profound, absolute pity mixed with a heavy dose of disgust. The judge addressed my husband, his voice echoing clearly through the quiet room. He asked Mr. Ethan to confirm his legal request. The judge spoke slowly, ensuring every single word was captured by the court stenographer. He asked Ethan if he was explicitly demanding a 50% share of this specific corporate entity. Ethan puffed out his chest, standing taller in his tailored suit. He had no idea what the judge had just read, but his blind arrogance overrode any sense of caution. Ethan offered a smug, entitled smirk. He looked directly at the judge and stated proudly, "Yes, Your Honor." He demanded every single penny of her little hobby. The judge let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head in sheer disbelief at the man standing before him. The magistrate picked up the portfolio again and opened it to the executive summary. He instructed the court reporter to log the financial disclosure into the official public record. The judge read the numbers aloud. His voice was steady and loud, carrying to the very back row of the public gallery. He announced that the corporate entity registered entirely under my name was currently valued at a baseline of $50 million. He paused, letting the massive number hang in the air before continuing. He stated that the company had recently completed a partial 30% acquisition buyout, resulting in a liquid cash payout of exactly $15 million. The silence that followed was absolute. It felt as though all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. I watched Ethan's physical reaction unfold in agonizing slow motion. The smug, victorious smirk literally fell off his face. His jaw went slack and his eyes widened to the size of saucers. All the color drained from his skin, leaving him looking completely ashen and sickly. His knees actually buckled beneath him, forcing him to grab onto the heavy wooden defense table just to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. From the second row of the gallery, a loud, sharp gasp cut through the silence. Vanessa had clapped both hands over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically between Ethan and me. The 25-year-old mistress who had mocked my cheap clothes and kicked my broken laptop off a porch was now staring at a woman worth $50 million. Ethan stood frozen, gripping the table, his knuckles turning stark white. His mind was violently trying to process the magnitude of his own catastrophic mistake. For 7 long years, he had ruthlessly mocked the very company that had just made me a multimillionaire. He had forced me to hide my work. He had called my late-night coding sessions a pathetic waste of time. He had berated me for trying to build something meaningful for neurodivergent children while he wasted our actual marital money on expensive dinners and cheap affairs. He had treated me like a dependent burden, while I was quietly constructing an absolute financial empire right under his roof. He had thrown me out into the freezing rain with exactly $14 in my checking account, completely unaware that I could have bought his entire corporate building in cash. The profound shock holding Ethan hostage only lasted for a few seconds. The realization of the massive wealth sitting in the courtroom quickly mutated into something entirely different. The shock evaporated rapidly, replaced by a wild, desperate, feral greed. Ethan suddenly stood up straight, his eyes burning with a manic, frantic energy. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed at the top of his lungs. He yelled that he wanted his half. He shouted that because we were married when I built the company, he was legally entitled to exactly half of that $15 million. He demanded the judge order the immediate transfer of $7.5 million into his frozen bank accounts. He frantically told his lawyer Donald to file the paperwork right now, claiming that this massive payout would easily clear his $200,000 debt and leave him incredibly wealthy. I was practically salivating at the thought of walking away from his ruined corporate career with a multi-million-dollar fortune. He believed his malicious basement discovery had just saved his life and secured his luxurious future with Vanessa. I did not speak. I did not need to. I simply remained seated and looked up at Harrison. Harrison slowly stood up from his chair. He reached forward and calmly secured the button of his tailored suit jacket, projecting an aura of absolute lethal confidence. He looked at Ethan, who was still shouting demands at his horrified attorney. Then Harrison turned his gaze up to the bench. Harrison spoke in a smooth conversational tone that sliced right through Ethan's frantic screaming. He addressed the magistrate directly, ensuring the court reporter caught every single syllable of the fatal blow he was about to deliver. "Actually, Your Honor," Harrison stated, his voice echoing with terrible finality, "he isn't entitled to a single cent." Harrison walked over to the court clerk desk and handed over a thin manila folder. He politely requested permission to project Defense Exhibit A onto the large digital monitors mounted on the courtroom walls. The judge nodded, granting the request immediately. The massive screens that had previously displayed Ethan forging my signature at the bank suddenly flickered to a brand new document. It was a crisp, high-resolution scan of the asset and debt cutoff agreement. It was the very same legal document Ethan had so eagerly and aggressively signed during our mandatory mediation session just a few weeks ago. Harrison directed the judge to look at the specific clauses highlighted in bright yellow ink on the screen. He read the dense legal jargon aloud, translating it into devastatingly simple and absolute terms for the public record. He reminded the court that Ethan had maliciously pushed for this specific document because he was absolutely desperate to protect his own upcoming corporate sales bonus from being divided in the divorce settlement. Harrison pointed a laser pointer at the heavy, arrogant signature at the very bottom of the page. He explained that by signing this binding contract against the desperate advice of his own attorney, Ethan had legally established a hard, irreversible financial boundary. The agreement clearly stated that any wealth acquired by either party after the exact date and time of the initial divorce filing was entirely off-limits and solely the property of the acquiring individual. Harrison then pulled up the certified banking records from my isolated trust and placed them side by side with the cutoff agreement on the large courtroom screens. He walked the judge through the timeline with surgical precision. He pointed out the exact minute Ethan slammed the divorce petition onto my empty dinner plate at the Boston Steakhouse. He showed the court the timestamp of when Ethan officially filed the dissolution of marriage with the county clerk. Then Harrison pointed to the incoming wire transfer logs from the massive educational conglomerate. The financial logs proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the $15 million acquisition payout had dropped into my secure account exactly 48 hours after Ethan filed his paperwork and legally sealed his own fate with the cutoff agreement. The judge leaned forward, resting his chin on his folded hands. He looked at the timeline on the screens, and a look of profound understanding washed over his stern face. He realized he was witnessing one of the most brilliant and perfectly executed legal traps ever presented in his courtroom. But Harrison did not stop there. He wanted to completely dismantle any desperate argument Ethan might try to make about the origin of my company. Harrison retrieved the original incorporation papers from 5 years ago and projected them for the entire room to see. He showed the court that the limited liability company was initially funded by a single small deposit of exactly $5,000. Harrison explicitly stated that this money was the modest inheritance left to me by my late father. Harrison explained to the attentive judge that because the seed money was strictly a familial inheritance, and because it was immediately placed into an isolated business trust, it was fully protected non-marital property from the very first day of its existence. He turned his body and looked directly at Ethan, who was shrinking into his heavy wooden chair. Harrison stated loud and clear that my husband had never contributed a single dime, a single hour of labor, or a single word of encouragement to my business. Harrison reminded the court that instead of supporting his wife, Ethan had spent 7 years relentlessly mocking my work, calling it a pathetic doodling hobby, and actively demanding I shut it down so I could focus on catering to his needs. Harrison contrasted my careful management of a $5,000 inheritance to build a $50 million empire against Ethan, stealing $200,000 from our home equity just to buy depreciating luxury items for his young mistress. The entire courtroom was suffocatingly quiet. In the second row of the gallery, Vanessa sank lower into the wooden bench. The reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her heavily made-up face. She had proudly helped Ethan throw me out into the freezing rain. She had worn my dead father bathrobe and laughed at my broken laptop. Now she was sitting in a courtroom, realizing she had tied her entire life to a disgraced, unemployed man facing federal forgery charges and massive, insurmountable debt. She had abandoned her own career and reputation for a man who had just legally locked himself out of a $15 million fortune because he was simply too arrogant to read a contract. Ethan sat completely frozen at the defense table. His brain was violently rejecting the reality of his own catastrophic actions. The devastating irony of the situation was finally sinking into his narcissistic mind. His own relentless greed and his overwhelming need to humiliate me had been the exact instruments of his total financial destruction. If he had just waited, if he had just been a decent partner, or even a patient adversary, he would have been legally entitled to half of my newly acquired wealth. His desperate rush to throw me away and protect his own meager corporate bonus was the very mechanism that sealed him out of my empire forever. Donald sat next to Ethan, looking completely pale and physically ill. The veteran defense attorney realized they had been entirely outmaneuvered from the very first day I walked into the mediation room. He frantically leaned over and began whispering urgently into Ethan's ear. Donald was desperately trying to explain the harsh legal reality of their situation. He whispered that they had no legal recourse left, that the cutoff agreement was completely ironclad, and that Ethan needed to sit quietly, accept his total defeat, and pray the judge showed mercy during the criminal referral. But Ethan was not a man who could accept defeat with any shred of dignity. He was a deeply arrogant narcissist who had just been publicly stripped of his money, his power, and his entire false identity. He had nothing left but his rage. Ethan slowly turned his head and looked across the wide courtroom aisle at me. I was sitting calmly at the plaintiff table, perfectly composed, completely untouchable, and utterly unbothered by his existence. I did not offer him a sympathetic smile. I did not look angry or vindictive. I simply looked at him with the cold, detached pity one might reserve for a complete stranger who had made a foolish mistake. The realization that I had beaten him at his own malicious game, that I was the brilliant mastermind he had always claimed to be, snapped the final fragile thread of his sanity. Ethan let out a guttural, furious roar that echoed violently off the high wooden ceilings of the courtroom. He shoved his heavy defense chair backward with such explosive force that it crashed loudly onto the polished floor. He completely ignored Donald's frantic attempts to grab his suit jacket. Ethan lunged directly across the wide center aisle toward the plaintiff table, His hands were curled into tight white-knuckled fists, and his face was twisted into a horrific mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was screaming my name, demanding his money, and fully intending to physically attack me right there in front of the presiding judge. I did not flinch. I did not scream or move a single muscle to defend myself. I knew exactly where I was, and I knew he would never reach me. Before Ethan could even cross halfway across the open floor, the two armed courtroom bailiffs sprang into immediate action. They moved with incredible speed, intercepting his path. One bailiff grabbed Ethan by the shoulder, while the other tackled him hard around the waist, driving his struggling body forcefully down onto the solid wood floor. The sound of his expensive suit tearing and the heavy thud of his body hitting the ground echoed through the room, followed immediately by the sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs being locked tightly around his wrists. The two armed bailiffs did not handle my husband with any degree of corporate courtesy. They hauled Ethan up from the polished hardwood floor by his upper arms, ignoring his shocked, sputtering protests. His expensive tailored suit jacket was ripped along the shoulder seam, covered in courthouse dust. His perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess hanging wildly over his sweating forehead. The bailiffs forced him roughly down into his heavy wooden chair at the defense table. They grabbed his wrists, pulling his arms behind his back, and locked the cold steel handcuffs directly to the sturdy wooden rungs of the chair, ensuring he could not make another violent move toward me. The presiding judge was practically vibrating with absolute judicial fury. He leaned far over the elevated mahogany bench, pointing his wooden gavel directly at Ethan. The magistrate informed my husband that his violent outburst was a direct assault on the dignity of the court. The judge stated loudly that he was formally holding Ethan in criminal contempt. Donald, the veteran defense attorney, had physically backed away from the table, completely washing his hands of his unhinged client. The judge did not call for a recess. He did not ask for closing arguments. He had seen the forged bank documents, the aggressive cutoff agreement, and the undeniable proof of my protected $15 million acquisition. The magistrate sat back down in his high-backed leather chair and picked up his heavy fountain pen. He announced that he was ready to issue his final binding ruling on the dissolution of our marriage right this very second. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the sharp scratching of the judge pen against the thick parchment paper. The magistrate read his final orders aloud for the official court record. He declared that our marriage was immediately and permanently dissolved. Then came the financial reckoning. The judge systematically dismantled my husband's entire financial existence with absolute legal precision. The magistrate ruled that I was to retain 100% of my corporate wealth, my limited liability company, my isolated trust account, and every single penny of my $15 million acquisition payout. The judge explicitly cited the cutoff agreement Ethan had so arrogantly signed, noting that Ethan had voluntarily and maliciously waived all rights to my assets. The magistrate then turned his attention to the massive fraudulent debt. He ordered that Ethan was to assume 100% of the $200,000 home equity line of credit. The judge stated that because the loan was obtained through documented federal bank fraud, the marital home located in Beacon Hill was to be immediately surrendered to the lending institution for foreclosure proceedings. Ethan was ordered to vacate the premises within 24 hours and surrender all keys to the bank authorities. The judge looked down at the ruined corporate executive sitting in handcuffs. He informed Ethan that a formal referral was being sent to the district attorney office regarding the felony forgery charges. He stated that Ethan would remain in police custody until a separate criminal bail hearing could be arranged. With one final resounding crack, the judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel onto the sounding block. The sharp noise echoed like a gunshot through the room, signaling the absolute death of my marriage and the total destruction of the man who had tried to bury me. The judge stood up, gathered his robes, and exited the courtroom through his private chambers. Harrison let out a long, slow breath. He reached over and snapped his leather briefcase shut. He looked at me with a profound expression of professional respect and offered a quiet congratulations. I stood up from the plaintiff table, smoothing the front of my navy blue blazer. I felt a tremendous, overwhelming sense of peace wash through my entire body. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for 7 long years was completely gone. I was finally entirely free. I picked up my large leather tote bag and turned to walk down the center aisle of the courtroom. Ethan was still handcuffed to his chair. The two bailiffs were standing right behind him, waiting for the transport officers to arrive. As I began to walk past the defense table, Ethan looked up at me. The blind, manic rage that had fueled his attempted attack just minutes ago had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a look of sheer pathetic desperation. The reality of his impending prison sentence, his total bankruptcy, and his ruined reputation had finally crushed him. He strained against his steel restraints, leaning his body toward me. His voice was shaking, cracking with unshed tears. He begged me to stop walking. He pleaded with me to listen to him for just 1 minute. "Jillian, please," he begged, his voice echoing pathetically in the emptying courtroom. "You cannot do this to me. You cannot leave me like this. I do not have a single dollar to my name. I cannot afford a criminal defense lawyer. They are going to send me to federal prison, Jillian." I did not stop walking, but I slowed my pace slightly. Ethan grew even more desperate. The arrogant man who had thrown divorce papers at my face and told me to live in a cardboard box was now openly sobbing. He tried to invoke our past, hoping to manipulate my empathy one last time. He cried out that we were married for 7 years. He pleaded that we were deeply in love once. He claimed that he had provided for me when I was just starting out and begged me to use a tiny fraction of my $15 million to post his criminal bail. I stopped at the edge of his defense table. I looked down at the man who had spent years mocking my intelligence, stealing from our home and financing a mistress. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer him a single word of sympathy or anger. I reached into my large leather tote bag. I pushed aside my clean, neat legal folders. My hand grasped the cold, cracked plastic of the object I had brought with me today specifically for this exact moment. I pulled out the old, battered work laptop. It was the same machine Vanessa had viciously kicked off my front porch into the freezing rain. The outer casing was covered in dried mud and deep scratches. The screen was completely shattered, spiderwebbed with thousands of tiny broken glass cracks. The keyboard was missing several keys, and the frame was visibly bent from the impact of hitting the wet concrete pavement. I held the ruined laptop over the polished wooden defense table right in front of Ethan's tear-streaked face. I simply opened my hand and let the heavy broken machine drop. It hit the table with a loud, harsh clatter. Loose pieces of plastic and broken keys scattered across the wood surface, coming to rest right next to Ethan's shackled hands. Ethan stared at the muddy, shattered computer, completely uncomprehending. I did not understand the profound poetry of the moment. He did not realize that this battered, broken piece of garbage was the exact machine I had used to write the original code for my educational platform. I had built a $50 million empire on that broken keyboard while he slept. I had created a fortune out of nothing while he was busy destroying everything we had. Now the divorce was final. I was walking out of this building with 100% of my incredible wealth, my thriving company, and my absolute freedom. I was walking out of this building in handcuffs, completely bankrupt, and facing federal prison. The visual representation of his total failure was sitting right in front of him. I was taking the empire, and he was left with the literal garbage. I did not say a single word to my ex-husband. I turned my back on his pathetic sobbing and walked straight down the center aisle, pushing through the heavy double doors and stepping out into the bright, bustling courthouse hallway. As the doors swung shut behind me, I saw the two transport officers walk past me, heading inside to collect Ethan. A few moments later, the doors opened again. The officers marched Ethan out into the public corridor. His hands were now cuffed securely in front of him, and his head hung low in absolute shame. Standing right in the middle of the busy hallway waiting for him was Vanessa. Ethan looked up, his eyes wide with desperate relief. He clearly believed that his young, beautiful mistress was waiting to comfort him. He likely assumed she would use her own credit cards to help bail him out of jail and support him through his impending criminal trial. He took a hopeful step toward her, his shackled hands reaching out slightly. Vanessa did not offer him a comforting embrace. She did not look at him with love or devotion. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She had sat in the courtroom gallery and listened as the judge outlined Ethan's massive debts and his total lack of corporate income. She realized she had blown up her own career to be the mistress of a penniless convicted felon. Vanessa reached into her designer purse. She pulled out the large, glittering engagement ring Ethan had proudly given her just a few weeks ago. She marched directly up to Ethan, ignoring the transport officers. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice carrying down the entire corridor. She yelled that she had taken the ring to a luxury jeweler downtown that morning, hoping to sell it for cash to cover her rent. Vanessa raised her hand high in the air. She screamed that the jeweler had laughed her right out of the store because the massive center stone was not a diamond at all. It was a cheap, worthless piece of cubic zirconia that Ethan had bought on a high-interest credit card to maintain his wealthy illusion. Vanessa threw the fake ring as hard as she could directly at Ethan's chest. The cheap metal bounced off his torn suit jacket and clattered uselessly onto the courthouse floor. She turned on her expensive heels and stormed down the hallway without looking back, leaving Ethan completely alone, bankrupt and ruined, standing in handcuffs, while the whole world watched him fall. 6 months passed since the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse closed on my marriage and sealed my ex-husband's fate. The justice system moved with surprising speed when presented with absolute undeniable financial fraud and corporate embezzlement. Ethan did not even attempt to take his case to trial. Faced with the high-definition security footage of his forgery, the certified banking logs, and the crushing testimony of his former employers, he accepted a rapid plea deal. He is currently serving a 24-month sentence in a federal minimum security facility. He was forced to declare total catastrophic bankruptcy. The bank immediately seized the beautiful Beacon Hill home we once shared, selling it at public auction to recoup the fraudulent home equity line of credit. He walked into that courtroom firmly believing he was a corporate king and walked out as a disgraced inmate with absolutely nothing to his name. I often imagine him trading his expensive tailored suits for a standard issue uniform, completely stripped of the superficial status symbols he used to measure human worth. Patricia suffered a downfall that was perhaps even more agonizing for her because it played out entirely in the ruthless public eye. The moment the news of Ethan's felony conviction hit the local business papers, her carefully curated aristocratic illusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The elite country clubs she used to terrorize quietly but firmly revoked her memberships, citing moral turpitude clauses in their strict bylaws. Her wealthy, influential friends stopped returning her phone calls, utterly unwilling to associate with the mother of a convicted fraudster who had been publicly subpoenaed for financial coercion. Desperate to pay for Ethan's mounting criminal defense fees and drowning in her own suffocating credit card debt, she was forced to sell her sprawling suburban estate at a massive loss. She now lives in a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city, completely stripped of the haughty power she once wielded like a weapon. Then there was Vanessa. After throwing her fake cubic zirconia engagement ring at Ethan in the courthouse hallway, she quickly realized that actions have severe, lasting professional consequences. The corporate technology industry in Boston is a surprisingly small, interconnected world. Word of her direct involvement in Ethan's embezzlement and their highly inappropriate office affair spread rapidly through the elite hiring networks. Headhunters flagged her resume as a massive liability. Competitors flatly refused to interview her. Stripped of Ethan's stolen money and facing mounting aggressive collections from her luxury downtown condo, she became increasingly desperate. She spent 6 grueling months applying for every junior sales position she could find, just trying to keep a roof over her head. That blind desperation led her directly to the towering glass headquarters of my newly expanded educational technology company. Following the $15 million acquisition deal, my company had scaled massively and secured additional rounds of heavy investment. We moved our operations into a pristine 3-floor office space in the absolute heart of the financial district. We were actively hiring dozens of new sales representatives to handle our nationwide rollout. Vanessa saw the blind corporate job posting online and submitted her resume completely unaware of who actually owned the hiring company. She managed to pass the initial automated screenings and the preliminary phone interviews with my human resources team by using a slightly altered version of her professional history. She was invited up to the executive floor for a final in-person interview for a junior sales associate position. I was sitting at the head of the long marble conference table when the heavy frosted glass doors opened. Penelope sat to my right, quietly reviewing applicant files. I was wearing a sharp-tailored white suit, my hair pulled back, perfectly composed and fully in my element. Vanessa walked into the boardroom wearing a cheap off-the-rack beige blazer, carrying a portfolio that looked hastily thrown together. She had her best fake enthusiastic customer service smile plastered across her face. She stepped into the room looking down at her notes and began her practiced greeting, thanking the chief executive officer for the incredible opportunity to join such an innovative platform. Then she finally looked up. The cheap plastic portfolio slipped right out of Vanessa's hands, hitting the plush carpeted floor with a dull thud. Her jaw dropped completely open, and all the color drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and pale. She stared at me sitting in the massive leather executive chair and stopped breathing entirely. The woman she had called pathetic, the woman whose broken laptop she had violently kicked off a porch into the freezing rain, was now sitting at the head of a multi-million-dollar corporation, holding her entire professional future in her hands. She recognized the sleek logo on the wall behind me and realized with absolute horrifying clarity that the empire Ethan had mocked was a towering fortress of actual legitimate wealth. I did not laugh. I did not sneer or mock her cheap clothes the way she had once mocked mine. I simply gestured to the empty chair across the long table and politely invited her to sit down. Vanessa practically collapsed into the chair, her hands shaking so badly she had to hide them under the cold marble table. I conducted the interview with flawless, chilling professionalism. I asked her highly specific questions about her sales strategies, her long-term client retention rates, and her ability to handle complex ethical dilemmas in the workplace. Vanessa stumbled over every single answer. Her voice shook, her eyes darted nervously around the expansive room, and she completely failed to articulate a single coherent business strategy. She was a woman who relied entirely on manipulation and stolen money to get ahead, and stripped of those tools she had absolutely nothing of value to offer. After 10 agonizing minutes, I closed her resume folder and folded my hands on the table. I looked directly into her terrified eyes. I told Vanessa that our company was built on a strict foundation of absolute integrity, transparency, and relentless hard work. I explained that we required our employees to demonstrate exceptional character, especially when handling sensitive educational accounts for vulnerable children. I kept my voice perfectly level and informed her that based on her professional history and her demonstrated lack of moral judgment, she was simply not a fit for our corporate culture. I politely thanked her for coming in and wished her luck in her future endeavors. Vanessa did not argue. She did not raise her voice or throw a tantrum. The crushing weight of her own profound inadequacy finally silenced her. She bent down, picked up her dropped portfolio, and walked out of my boardroom, with her head hung in absolute burning shame. She finally understood that true power does not come from loud, empty arrogance or stolen credit cards. It comes from silent, relentless perseverance. Later that evening, I stood on the expansive wrap-around balcony of my brand-new penthouse apartment. The vibrant city of Boston stretched out below me, a glittering ocean of lights reflecting beautifully off the dark water of the harbor. The cool evening breeze ruffled my hair, but I felt perfectly warm. It was a stark, profound contrast to the freezing rain I had stood in exactly 6 months ago when I was locked out of my own home. Inside my spacious, open-concept living room, I could hear the sound of genuine, joyful laughter. Penelope was pouring drinks at the custom marble island, while Harrison traded brilliant legal stories with my lead software developers. These were not shallow transactional relationships built on status or stolen wealth. These were true friends, colleagues, and allies who had stood by me when I was building complex code on a broken keyboard in the middle of the night. I raised my crystal flute of vintage champagne to the shimmering city skyline, taking a slow, appreciative sip. I thought about the man who had thrown divorce papers in my face and told me to live in a cardboard box. I thought about the aristocratic mother-in-law who tried to buy my silence for $5,000. I thought about how they had all confused my quiet patience for weakness. They had spent 7 years trying to make me feel small, completely unaware that I was methodically laying the heavy bricks of a fortress they could never breach. I was not just a survivor of a toxic, financially abusive marriage. I was the sole architect of my own empire. I was untouchable, completely independent, and utterly free. If you have ever had to quietly build your strength while dealing with people who constantly underestimated your worth, let me know your story in the comments below. Never let their loud arrogance distract you from your silent building. Hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power and reminding them exactly who they are dealing with. Thank you for watching, and remember, the best revenge is simply massive, undeniable success.